Good morning. Mike Sams and Drew Colby here for the Kenny and Sams monthly construction law webinar series. We've been happy to bring these to you for a while now. As most of you know, Kenny and Sams is a trial practice and risk management firm. We practice on the civil side fairly well across the whole spectrum with significant buckets in employment law, business to business disputes, shareholder disputes, lots of insurance coverage work, and of course, the reason we're here today, our largest area of practice is construction law work. Um, and so what we're doing monthly is coming to you guys with bits and pieces, 30-minute segments on good risk management or best practices in the risk management area. As I said, I'm Mike Sams. I'm here with my partner, Drew Colby. Why don't you introduce yourself and maybe you can talk to them a little bit about what we've done and what they can find and what we're going to talk about today.
Sure. Drew Colby, been practicing construction law for over 35 years. Half my practice is transactional, drafting and reviewing construction contracts. The other half is litigation, handling dispute resolution. So we've done these now for I think we've done eight installments prior to this one. And what we do is we bring industry leaders, people in the firm, to come and talk about areas with which they have a lot of subject matter knowledge. And so far, we've covered a lot of really interesting topics, and we've gotten a lot of good feedback from people. Our first topic was on price escalation because that was always a huge concern to people. What do we do? Lumber's going through the roof, copper, concrete, labor costs. How do we handle cost escalation in contracts? The next one we did was on employment best practices. We've done them on key insurance terms. We've also done them on prompt pay traps and obligations, mechanics liens, liquidated damages, residential construction issues, and the claims process. And the next one that we're going to do is on March 17th, and that deals with contract termination, which is a really important topic. And it's one that's vastly misunderstood by most people. In the case that I always cite, there's a Washington Providence case that came out some time ago where a contractor didn't get paid. And then the contractor walked off the job and terminated the contract because he didn't get paid. And the owner came back and said, wait a minute, you had to give us notice before you terminated that contract, and you didn't. And as a result, when they went into court, the court found that the contractor who hadn't been paid was indeed the one that breached the contract and suffered big damages,
Even though he hadn't been paid.
even though he hadn't been paid. So the purpose of the termination is to understand what your rights are. And that, again, that's going to be the topic on March 17th. Do you have to give notice? Do you have to give cure? Does the architect have to certify it, et cetera? We want to keep you out of trouble. That's a great program to do it. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. Today we're talking about cost plus contracts, and Mike's going to start off the discussion just generally differentiating cost plus contracts with lump sum contracts. Mike?
Thanks, Drew. Very briefly, you know that there are three different types, principally three different types of contracts. You've got your lump sum, also known as your fixed price contract. You've got cost plus, and you've got GMP contracts. There's benefits to each of them as you're considering what you may want to do and whether you want to enter into a particular type of contract. I think you should think about the benefits and the negatives that go with each one. I'm going to talk about them for 2 seconds here, and then we'll turn it over to Drew to dive into cost plus contracts and some contingency clause issues. Obviously, with the lump sum, you've got a fixed price. And so that can be beneficial, can give the owner some real comfort level. The owner knows what it's going to pay for the construction, assuming there's no change orders. Put a bookmark in that, the change order piece. On the positive side for the contractor, assuming that it's got a good margin in there, the lump sum can be very good for the contractor. Downside for the contractor is if you end up buying out subs and the cost is much more than what you expected, or you don't do a good job lining up subcontractor change order rights with your own change order rights vis-a-vis you and the owner, and the cost on your end explodes and you're not able to pass all of that on. And I'm speaking specifically, I'm seeing that coming up in the area of material cost escalation right now. That again, lump sum can start out looking good and can go badly. So on the lump sum side for the contractor, if you've got good margins in there and you've aligned your subcontracts with your general contract in terms of the ability to get change orders when appropriate, lump sum can be very good for everybody. There's certainty in what's happening. The uncertainty right now with respect to lump sum, and and with GMP too, is with material cost escalation issues, and with supply chain disruption, the delays and costs that go with that. From the owner's perspective, lump sum, as I said, can be positive. They've got a theoretically, depending on what the change order section says, a fixed number, and they know what they need to get by way of lending, et cetera. On the downside, sometimes owners feel a little less comfortable with the fixed price because although they've got some certainty on the cost, there's not as much transparency. They don't get to open your books and take a look at them. And there are those owners out there who think you guys are pushing around big wheelbarrows of money and that they're getting taken advantage of, so they don't have that same comfort level with the fixed price. Another form of the contract, of course, is the GMP. GMP, I actually think, is a very good model for the owner. It can also be a good model for the contractor for the same reason that the fixed price can. If you've got a good GMP number, you've been able to negotiate to a good GMP number as the contractor, you can feel comfortable that you're going to get this job done. You've built into the contract whatever your profit is, whether it's going to be a markup on costs or whether it's a fee, so you know what you're getting. Owner gets transparency in getting to take a look at what the costs are. And a big piece of this, I think, that you should be thinking about when you're doing GMP contracts is the savings issue. That is, if you're agreeing to cap what you're going to charge the owner and you're taking on the risk that it not go above that GMP number, as I think many of you look at, if we're taking on that sort of risk, we should have some upside too, and frankly, some incentive, and that benefits the owner if we get some sort of sharing in the savings. So the GMP can be something that makes everybody comfortable. I've seen that a lot over the past years. Again, you're going to have to take a look at your change order section though, and you got to be really careful with that as a contractor to make sure you're careful about material cost escalation rights and delay related issues and the costs that go with delay. I think we may have talked about it before in one of our programs here. One of the things that owners may try to creep into your contract is a no damages for delay clause, and especially with supply chain disruption as it is and things dragging on much longer than anyone would like, you don't want to be in a position where you can't capture your delay related costs. So take a look at that with the GMP. And then we've got Cost Plus, and Cost Plus gives the owner the transparency they want. It allows the contractor to not have to take on risk. And in today's marketplace where material cost escalation is such a big thing and delay can be such a big thing because of the supply chain disruptions, and in addition to all the other issues that go into construction projects, Cost Plus is a popular method of doing things. Of course, if you're going to do Cost Plus, you have to take into account that there may be more administrative costs. That is, you're going to have to be really diligent about assembling subcontractor costs. You're going to have to make sure your subs understand what they need to provide you by way of backup for getting paid so that you can then pass that along to the owner to make sure that you're getting paid. Drew, let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, so there's the administrative burden side of a cost plus contract should not be overlooked. It's a large administrative burden on the part of the contractor. You're likely going to have to produce subcontract agreements, vendor agreements, things you paid. But it's also a big burden on the owner. And one of the things the contractor has to make sure of is that the owner has the facilities or the ability to appropriately administer the contract. Who is looking at these invoices? Do they have subject matter knowledge? Do they understand the variances in the construction practice and what actually happens in the field versus what might theoretically happen in an office? For example, if you submit a rec that has, $5 worth of nails that you had to run down to in the middle of the job to pick up, for a project, and the owner looks at it and says, well, where's my receipt for this $5? There can be a lot of give and take on small items. It really helps as a contractor to understand who the owner has retained to administer the contract, to try to take some of the administrative burden risks away from the contract.
Can I jump in for one
Sure.
second?
Yep.
All more so where on a lot of your jobs, you're going to fall into prompt pay. On private jobs of $3 million or more, the prompt pay statute comes in, And of course, that's where you start to getting to payment deadlines. And payment deadlines aren't awful, but they need to be followed. And I think, especially if you're working with an owner who is maybe a little less sophisticated, hasn't done it that often, or is for the first time taking on a larger job, they need to be cognizant of the administrative review processes that Drew was just talking about in conjunction with the deadlines that they have to perform that work to assure that they're meeting their deadlines under prompt pay so that you can meet your deadlines to subcontractors under prompt pay.
Yep, and so there are differences between lump sum, and my estimate is, between the owner contractor, I'm probably seeing somewhere between 60 and 70% of the contracts now coming in as cost plus contracts. They do tend to have picked up a lot of steam over the last few years, probably 10 years or so, and they do seem to be the trend. There are certainly places for lump sum contracts, but they are out there, and they do seem, at least based on my experience, to be the more prevalent form of contracting at the owner to contractor level. Um, but they do present a risk to the contractor in that, you only get the cost of your work plus your fee, which is your profit. And you're capped out at that GMP if it's a GMP contract. So they do present some risks. So Mike mentioned the savings clause. Those savings clauses are actually pretty decent vehicles to cover cost escalation, because I know Mike, like what we've heard for the past year or more is lead times, and cost escalation. People order stuff, they can't get it delivered on time, it blows up the schedule, it costs more. That's the problems that we're seeing now. That's kind of the environment that we're in. And these savings clauses can be sometimes a funding mechanism, as can the contingency clause I'll talk about in a minute. But so there is some risk associated with cost plus, but there are ways to mitigate it, and we're going to address some of those today. One of the unique characteristics of a cost plus contract is the relationship of the parties. I'm going to use the standard A102 contract because that's probably the most prevalent large project cost plus contract that's in the marketplace right now, at least most widely used. That Article 3 identifies the relationships of the parties, and they use the term the contractor accepts the relationship of trust and confidence. Right? Those are terms that are usually synonymous with a fiduciary relationship. A fiduciary relationship is ordinarily the relationship that's entered into between joint ventures or partners in a business operation, not usually in the context of a contractor to owner situation. But if you look at the cost plus, the contractor does have an obligation to drive these prices down for the benefit of the owner. So there's an issue here of, what is this relationship? And when I get these contracts and I'm representing the contractor, I don't want a fiduciary relationship, because a fiduciary relationship imposes a burden on the contractor of utmost good faith and loyalty. That's a very high standard, and the penalties for violating that standard can be very punitive, quite frankly. So when I'm drafting these contracts on behalf of a contractor, I'll put language at the bottom that says, notwithstanding the language in this paragraph, the parties agree that there is no fiduciary relationship that's created. A few years ago, I had a big case that actually came down to that point, and I did research throughout the country, and I found there are a number of courts out there that have found, indeed, that there's a fiduciary relationship between an owner and a contractor on a cost plus contract, simply because the contractor, to some extent, is acting as the owner's agent to drive price down. So be careful that you don't stumble into a fiduciary relationship situation on a cost plus contract if that's not your intention going into this thing. And because there are real significant risks associated with establishing that type of a relationship. This trust and confidence language is only found in the cost plus contract. The contract does not owe that duty in a typical lump sum or fixed price contract. So
And they wouldn't, because
they would
there's a lump sum agreement in place. There's no duty to, they don't, there's no reason the owner in that instance even needs to know about what the subcontractor is charging to the general contractor, except perhaps, I guess it could come into play if you ended up with some sort of cost plus change order or the like, some sort of amendment to the contract. Right. But otherwise, there's no cause for it in the fixed price.
There really isn't. Except for a change, a change of the work, the contractor will have the obligation typically to verify and substantiate the actual costs associated with the change order. And if it's an executed change order, that might not be the case, but if it's a pending change order or a claim or an extra or a disputed, change order, then there would have to be substantiation, and under those circumstances, you'd have that kind of backup. But
Sorry,
typically,
I sidetracked you.
that's all right. But typically in a fixed price, you don't have to worry about that. Um, so the next unique feature of a cost plus contract is this concept of the cost of the work. What is the cost of the work? Again, in a fixed price contract, it says this is the work we're going to perform, and this is the price we're going to get paid, and it's done. You put together a schedule of values, and you work off that. But in a cost plus contract, they delineate all these items that are the cost of the work, and then they delineate all these items that aren't included in the cost of the work. So when you're reviewing and drafting these contracts, it's really important to look at these things and understand what they say. The AI has been around for over 100 years, and they understand, based on cases that have happened throughout the country during that period of time, how nuanced some of these points are. So they'll put in things like your labor costs are going to be labor, wages, burden, and some other things. And when you're administering a contract, or when you're handling it as a general contractor, you look at it and say, I have to keep track of my hours, I have to keep track of my labor burden, I have to keep track of, all these other things. What I often do when I draft, and Mike, I'm sure you do the same thing, is we just use labor sheets and all in number. Our carpenters charge this, our laborers charge this, this is our fixed price for this. So that you're not having to dig down and pull payroll records and, justify benefits, a burden,
I
et
think the
cetera.
benefit of that too, of getting the numbers out in front into the document, assures, it gives the owner some assurances too, that, the owner can take a look and assess whether those numbers make sense to the owner. The owner may be really sophisticated and completely understand it. The owner may not have a real frame of reference for it, but get the numbers out in front of the owner so you're not running into problems later.
Yeah, what you really want to do is you want to avoid a mathematical exercise with the owner whose outcome is relatively uncertain, right? So if you can monetize, if you can establish a fixed cost for some of these items, like general conditions, uh, insurance costs, 1.2%, or whatever the number happens to be. If you can get these fixed costs in, then the cost of the work is much easier to track, it's much easier to follow, and it's much easier to administer. Instead of producing weekly hour reports that they can challenge, now you just have a labor rate that they know goes into the project. That labor rate then is built into the schedule of values, and it's something against which your recs are built. So it just makes administratively an otherwise administratively burdensome form of contracting more manageable.
Here's the overarching point I'd like to make, and that is, as Drew said, the AIA has they've had an experience in dealing with these things, and so they have dropped a ton of specifics into the cost of the work section. I'm just briefly looking at it right now in the A102 document. It's probably broken down into 20 some different subparts of costs. You may be in a situation where you're not using the AIA. It's therefore really important that you focus on the cost of the work. How is it being defined? What's being covered? You may actually want to pull up the Cost Plus from the AIA if you're not using the AIA, just as a checklist to make sure that the costs you're thinking of or assuming are covered are actually identified. Because what happens in these Cost Plus contracts is sort of at the end of the contract, you'll often see language that says one of two things. If there's a safety net for the contractor, the language will say, and all other costs properly incurred in performance of the work. That's a pretty big safety net, and the owner may object to that. The owner may want to narrow that down. That sort of language is going to give you a really nice catch-all, but you might not have that. What you do see on the flip side of it is, unless the costs have been identified above, they are not costs of the work. That's sort of the opposite of what I just described. And in those instances, you better really carefully dig in and make sure that the itemized costs of the work in the contract are all of the costs of the work that you're going to be looking for. I'm looking at 7.7.1 of the A102 right now, and at the end it says other costs incurred in performance of the work, but only with the owner's prior approval. Again, so that's sort of an example where if you haven't itemized it as a cost of the work, you're probably not going to be able to recover it unless the owner subsequently agrees that that's something that can be appropriately charged. But don't put yourself at the mercy of the owner. And I'm not trying to make owners the bad guys. They're not. They're trying to do business too. But you just don't want to be in that situation where you're trying to collect on a cost that you assumed was covered, and the owner doesn't think it's covered, and it's not listed in your contract.
Yeah, let me just touch on that real brief. Don't even turn that from that page. I'm gonna just pick. This is what happens when you don't like monetize your items and instead have to go through a mathematical formula using the same provision that Mike just wrote. All other costs with the owner's prior approval. If we were to get that case in, right, we would say the owner approved it and we're representing the contractor. Well, the owner approved it because they saw the work go in, right? Their admin person was there on site. They saw it go in. They approved it. If I'm representing the owner, we say, no, we didn't approve it writing. Everything else we have to approve in writing. We didn't approve it writing. What's the long and short of that? From your standpoint, you just bought yourself some litigation. That's what you want to avoid. That's why you want to like monetize. You want to address these things, line item them, and so you don't have to go through a mathematical exercise. It will just get you in trouble. And that's why I'm a huge fan of labor sheets and other sheets that kind of monetize this, make them exhibits to these contracts, clean them up so that we don't create problems inadvertently.
Mhm.
So let me just jump on some other topics here. What else makes this cost plus contract so unique? The accounting and audit rights. Right? At the end of the project, the owner can tear through your books, which they have every right to do to make sure that what you've billed to this project should have been billed to the project. Right? I just did a cost plus contract this week with a contractor said, I don't want the contractor going, I don't want the owner going through my books. Those are my books. And we said, well, it's a cost plus contract. How are they going to verify your costs? Yeah, you submitted all these expenses as you came through, and we got, we'll get lien waivers and all that sort of stuff. But we need to substantiate this thing at the end? We have those rights, and so just be mindful of that. You can limit it and say, they can only audit if there's a dispute, and then as to only those items only. The audit, we have the right to clean our books so that they can only see this project. There's ways to soften that so that it doesn't expose the contract to excessive administrative work and complying with audit obligations.
I guess the contract point on that, Drew, is when you're negotiating the contract, don't gloss over the owner's audit rights. Focus on those. If you want them to be more narrow, then work on making them more narrow in the contract. Otherwise, you're going to have to, you're going to have that burden at the end of the job.
Yep, because the contract is written, is pretty broad in terms of what the owner can do. The last thing I want to touch on today is contingency clauses. You say, what is a contingency clause? Is no place in a cost plus contract. It's a cost plus. Why would a contingency factor into that? And this goes back to what we talked about originally. The problems that we're seeing in the construction industry are lead time and additional cost escalation associated with lead time, supply chain disruption. So what I did this week is I had a contract I was drafting, and the contract said I will not sign a cost plus GMP. I will sign a cost plus because I don't know what my costs are. So what we did to kind of ameliorate the harsh effect of a cost escalation is that we created a contingency and said, these are your material costs. We're going to have them line item in the schedule of values. And if the material costs go over, then that gets funded from the contingency clause. So the contractor with a built-in contingency clause in the cost plus agreed then to a cost plus with a GMP. So there's a number of different ways you can build in these contingency clauses. One could be you can focus on a certain number of materials. If lumber goes over, if steel goes over, if this goes over, then. Or you can lump sum all your material costs and say if the material costs collectively go over, then. And you can also dump a delta on it. So if all the material costs go over by 2%, the contractor might own the first 2%. Everything else to that goes to the owner and gets funded through a contingency, or any from $1 that it goes over this fixed sum, then it comes out of the contingency. But the problems we're facing now are lead times, supply chain disruption, and cost escalation. And there are ways to build in protections in these contracts, and we've done them. And if somebody comes in, they want a contract, we make the contract work, and we make those clauses kind of fit the needs, risks, and rewards that both parties need to execute the contract. So our next presentation, again, is on March 17th on contract termination. That's a really important one. Be very careful if you're going to terminate a contract. It's usually best to advise counsel before you do that. I had one that we terminated not that long ago, and the owner, I was representing the owner on that one. They were all set to terminate, and I looked at the contract and said, no, you need the architect's certification that you had grounds to terminate. You can't just willy-nilly go out there and terminate them because they breached the contract, which they did. You also need, the architect's certification, and it has to, in your certification, that the architect's certified in good faith. So these are really important topics. If you want to see any of these presentations, just jump right onto our website. They'll be there within a day or two of us actually doing these presentations, and you can review them at your leisure. They're only half an hour plus or minus, but they're extremely substantive and extremely helpful. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us.